Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you my final Tales to Give You Goosebumps book review. If you've been following me since the very early days of my channel, you should know that one of my very first book reviews was the sixth book in this collection, known as More and More and More Tales to Give You Goosebumps. And I found it to be fitting that I saved the first book ever in this collection for last. And the first one, of course, is aptly titled Tales to Give You Goosebumps. Now, this has been 3 years and some change in the making of me finally getting through this series. And the reason why I never really binged through this series, even though it's only 6 books, is the fact that I haven't been the biggest fan of this run of Goosebumps books. As a matter of fact, I would honestly say this is one of my least favorite series out of the entire franchise. But that does not discredit there are some great stories out there in the bunch in this run of books. And after reading this one in particular, it makes me realize that I might have been harsh on book 2. If you remember my review on book 2, I feel like I was really harsh on that book for having like a half and half reaction for me. And here is kind of the same situation, but it's more on that, you know, there's not enough highs like book 2 had, and not quite the lows book 2 had as well. But I feel like I was unfair to that one because thinking back on that book, I think that book had way stronger stories than this one. With that being said, I think that this book, like most of the series, is kind of mid for me. I am not the person that's going to sit here and recommend this series of short stories. Even though I have mentioned in the past that some of these short stories I want to see full books, or some of these short stories went on maybe in name only, or had some solid adaptations in the show that I really enjoyed. But aside from that, I don't really think fondly on this, aside from a handful of ones that I really love. And stay tuned for that, because I'm going to be ranking all 60 of these Tales to Give You Goosebumps stories from worst to best, in my opinion, of course. And I think that's going to be a fun little popcorn experience for you all. But this first one, you know, for this coming out in what, 1994, it came out right around the time the OG62 was still kind of, you know, in its infancy. It was in the mid-20s of that run when this came out. It started a short story trend that carried through until at least the end of the OG62. It lasted 6 books, and I can definitely tell that this one was, I guess, the ground zero and the book that they probably learned from the most, even though I do think the quality is super inconsistent across this series as a whole. This one has a lot of the same issues as the other ones, but I think in all the other books, there were some perfect stories in here. And mild spoilers, there is no perfect story in this book for me. This was the only book to not produce at least one, which was really sad. But there are some strong standouts in here, and we'll get into that very shortly. So, if you don't know anything about Tales to Give You Goosebumps, starting with this book and all the way to book 6, each book collection has 10 stories. And in this book, the stories are The House of No Return, Teacher's Pet, Strained Peas, Strangers in the Woods, Good Friends, How I Won My Bet, Mr. Teddy, Click, Broken Dolls, and A Vampire in the Neighborhood. So we're going to run down all these stories, and I'm just going to give you my thoughts very briefly without giving too much away, okay? So the first story is The House of No Return. Now, The House of No Return might be the most famous of these Tales to Give You Goosebumps short stories. It was turned into an episode in the original show. It also had a sneak preview book made for it. It was printed in a book collection outside of Goosebumps known as Scary 2. So this might be the most recognizable short story out there, minus maybe the Haunted House game, I would say. But the story is essentially about these 3 kids, led by a guy named Robbie, who's narrating the story. They're part of this club called the Danger Club, and so it's right before Halloween, and they're trying to recruit this one kid to join the Danger Club. But like all the other recruits they've tried, they end up not passing this test. And the test is, there's a house on this street where the 3 people in the Danger Club like are trying to recruit these kids by putting them in the house, in this old abandoned house with like no grass, dead trees all over the yard. And they have to stay there at night for at least a whole hour to initiate themselves into the club, but no kid has been able to do it. And they come up with this idea after they've run through pretty much every kid possible to try to recruit this new one known as Chris Wakely. And Chris is pretty naive. He's kind of a scaredy cat, and they, for some reason, think that he's a good fit for their club, which makes no sense. But they decide to try to ask him to join. And they say, well, look, if you want to join us, you can do the initiation. And he pretty much stiff arms them. So after he blows them off, they get this bright idea that on Halloween, maybe it would be a good idea to try to force him to do this initiation. And if he goes through with it, he can join the club. So there are some descriptions about what these kids dress up like. One of them dresses up like a purple monster with googly eyes. Another one dresses up like Freddy Krueger. And another one, I think, dresses up like a zombie or something. I forget. But they go to Chris Wakely's house on Halloween. He's in his costume. He's handing out candy. And they're like, you come with us now. And they take him over to the house and put him inside and shut the door in a pretty mean fashion. And they wait along the street corner and observe to see how long he can stay in there. And as the time goes along, 10 minutes go by, 20 minutes go by, 30 minutes go by. And before you know it, the hour is up and they think that it's time to recruit Chris to the club. And when they go up to investigate the situation, they realize something might be wrong. And they go inside the house and they discover something inside the house that might imply that it's really haunted and something terrible might happen to these kids. But it's never too far or anything. And that's essentially what you're going to expect out of the House of No Return. Honestly, this one is probably one of the more fine stories of Tales to Give You Goosebumps. It's pretty average in a lot of ways when it comes to these short stories. I know a lot of people seem to love this one, and I think it's probably because sometimes when you're starting a new ride or something, let's say you go to a new amusement park, and you pick the most anticipated roller coaster, or maybe the first roller coaster of the park or whatever, and you ride it and you think it's like the greatest thing ever because it's the first. I think that's what people are raving about for this story, because it's the first one. It started off their experience with the series, and thus they think it's so great. But in actuality, if you read around, it's not that great. Yeah, it's just pretty average to me. So the second story is Teacher's Pet. And this story is about, this one was kind of odd. It's about this girl named Becca and Benji. Becca is the narrator. They are starting their 6th grade year, so they're actually a little bit on the younger side of these Goosebumps protagonists here. And they have this teacher named Mr. Blankenship, and their teacher is not the kind of guy that they were looking forward to be their 6th grade teacher. They were hoping for another one, but they didn't get lucky and they got stuck with this guy. But Mr. Blankenship has snakes all over his classroom, and like snake cages and, I guess terrariums or whatnot all over the class. And he says to the kids when they, first meet him, that the entire school year is going to be focused on learning with snakes. And pretty much the whole story is about Becca and Benji feeling creeped out by these snakes. There's a dream sequence with Becca thinking that these snakes are followed her home in her backpack, and it's a fake out and all that. And then there's a very tense scene involving mice, because, snake eats mice. And Mr. Blankenship flips out on the class about a mice escaping, and apparently that's wasting snake food, and pretty much punishes the whole class. So to get even, Becca and Benji decide to break into the school late at night to free all the mice. But much to their chagrin, when they get there, they find this big cobra that's nestled in this cage behind Mr. Blankenship's desk that's all usually empty. And they figure out the ghastly truth of what this cobra is. And because this is Tales to Give You Goosebumps, a lot of the times they throw some goofy oddball endings in there. And this one has kind of a corny, tongue-in-cheek one involving the main characters and what this snake is. So that's essentially this story for Teacher's Pet. This one, it's just one of those meh stories. It's kind of leaning that bad territory, but I just feel whatever with it. There's not a lot that happens here. And if I'm being honest, it's kind of a nothing story, but it's also nothing offensive. I do think there's some solid body horror moments here. And the scene where Mr. Blankenship freaks out on the class is pretty tense. So, yeah, I had a decent time with it, but still, it's just a mess story overall. So the third story is Strained Peas. Now, this one, y'all, this one was rough. So the concept of this one is that this boy named Nicholas, he's like 12 years old, and he's at home one day, and he hears a car pull up, and it's his parents bringing home his baby sister. And while this is going on, he's reading an Iron Man comic, and he's looking at a villain that has like a birthmark or like a face defect that's like a sign of evil or something. So when his baby sister comes home, he notices that there's a birthmark on her cheek, and I think the baby's name is, what, Hannah or something? And he thinks that the baby's a mark of evil. And he gets convinced that this baby's evil. And as the story goes along, some weird, odd occurrences start happening that are mostly circumstantial, that can imply that maybe this baby is actually evil and a monster, or maybe she's just doing baby things, getting into trouble because she's a baby and doesn't know any better. You never really know, because a lot of this stuff happens off page. But for example, he swears that his baby sister ate his homework on purpose, his math homework paper. Then another thing is, he wakes up, and I'm not kidding, this is a scene in the book. He had paint supplies, and somehow this all-white room inside of his home was painted with multicolors in like a pretty intricate way, to the point where it's obvious that a 1-foot-tall baby cannot reach an entire wall length. It just makes no sense. But somehow he gets blamed for it, and which makes sense. But he thinks that the baby did it, right? And then it builds up to this, I guess, climax where he's kind of started to pinpoint that all these occurrences are related to his baby sister. And he has this heart-to-heart with his mom, and he keeps saying, "You gotta believe me, Ma, you gotta believe me." It's one of those type of stories, and I hate it deeply for that. But she's like, you know what? You just need to stop pretending that all these bad stuff are happening and grow up a little bit, get mature. She's a baby. She's not doing this. And he tries to convince himself that that might be the case, but the story doesn't fully commit to that because, like I said, the climax is the baby picks up a pair of scissors and he thinks that she's trying to stab him. And then there's a recontextualization about baby Hannah, if she's actually Nicholas's sister, and there might be something that the family has to correct. And then, of course, when that's fixed, there's possibly a new baby that comes into the situation. And this baby is actually like front and center, not doing things off screen, and might be the real evil sister that he thought Hannah was. Let's just leave it there. So, all in all, for Strained Peas, what really bothers me about this one is that the story doesn't know what it wants to be. It tries to play on, slappy tropes from Night of the Living Dummy, which is fine to an extent, but everything is off page. We don't ever see baby Hannah have this reveal that she's doing this all on purpose. It's all circumstantial. And that might be a good segue to get into the mid portion of the story where the mom has the heart-to-heart with him, saying that, yo, you might be like pretending these things are happening, or you're convincing yourself these are when they're actually not. And I think that would have been a better direction for the story to go down. Like, he actually convinces himself that Hannah was just a normal baby. And then the surprise is that when his real sister comes home, that, hey, there could be actual evil babies out there, will throw the rug from under him. And that's at least a better setup than what we got here. There's just too much circumstantial things to buy into that this baby's actually doing this stuff on purpose to me. Like shoving paper in the mouth, babies do that. Picking up a pair of scissors. Babies love to pick up things if you leave a pair of scissors around, paint. If you give baby paint, they'll put it on their fingers and put it on the wall if you let them. They do that stuff, so it's all circumstantial. And I actually think that another good twist would have been is that maybe there was a reveal that he was doing this, but it's not, it could have gone the way that maybe he was being manipulated by the baby to do this with his own body, or maybe he did it to kind of lash out against the baby or something. That probably would have made more sense, but this was just straight up goofy, kind of dumb, lacked a real identity and believability. Yeah, this one was pretty bad. So yeah. The fourth story, Strangers in the Woods, this one was a mild letdown because like the first 2/3 of the story were great. The concept for this one is that this girl named Lucy is gone to stay with her aunt, who she hasn't, been close with in recent years. Her parents are 1,000 miles away, and she's brought her dog with her. I think, I want to say his name is like Wolfster or something like that. Sorry if I'm getting the dog's name wrong. But the moment that she brings her dog to her aunt's house, there's something about the woods that seem off, and the dog is barking hysterically towards the woods and at the aunt. So the dog now has to sleep outside, and Lucy's kind of upset, and she notices little things about her aunt that she normally gets right that she's getting wrong, like her famous cookies don't taste as perfect as they used to. These scrambled eggs that she loves from her aunt don't taste as good as they used to. And of course, the behavior of the dog is really out of normal. And she starts to get this suspicion where she thinks she sees lights in the sky going down to the woods, and something has to be up with the woods. And she hears a phone call about her aunt saying that, oh, she doesn't know the truth yet. She doesn't know what's going on in the woods. And this prompts Lucy to take action and go investigate. But when she does, it's one of those rug pull from under you type of stories for the reader, where pretty much everything is recontextualized to be done in a way because certain things happen, like the aunt lost her glasses or forgot a recipe or whatever the case may be, had a headache. I forget what the exact reason is, but stuff like, mundane stuff like that. And the whole stuff in the woods is essentially a movie set. But you get a twist in the end that feels kind of tacked on and just forced in there to be, I guess, charming, but it doesn't succeed at that, and that's what really tanks this story for me. It's just that final third of the story gets really hokey, and it tanked it down pretty considerably. I don't know if I've been keeping up with ratings. I gave like the first one like a 3.5 out of 5 stars. The second one, A Teacher's Pet, was like a 2.5 out of 5 stars. The Strained Peas was a 2 out of 5 stars. This one is probably like a flat 3 out of 5 stars. This one's like, okay. It's just okay. And that's all I really have to say about it. It's a big disappointment. In the fifth story, we'll get into probably my least favorite of this whole book, Good Friends. Good Friends, in essence, is an all-for-nothing story. But I definitely can see people loving this one if you're willing to accept the biggest flaw, which is the thing that holds it back considerably for me. So the story is about, I forget the boy's name. I don't know why, but it's about a boy. He's afraid of his older brother, and he has a friend named Jordan. And his friend Jordan has a little sister that has an imaginary friend. But Jordan, how this whole story begins, they're walking home to this kid's house, and Jordan's like, why don't you come play some basketball with me? And he's like, well, I got to do my homework, and plus my older brother, I think his name is Brendan. It's like a 14-year-old kid. Is like in charge of me while my parents are at work, and he's been a jerk to me recently. But I guess if I tell him I did my homework, we can play some basketball. So the boys are playing basketball. They get hassled by Brendan a little bit. And then Jordan's sister comes into the equation, where it's her and her imaginary friend are playing and all that. And Jordan decides to mess around with his sister's imaginary friend, which bothers her in a pretty alarming way, where she starts to freak out and threaten to tell her mom and all that. And the main character is kind of taken back by it and is like, you know, why does your sister believe imaginary friends? And he's like, I don't know. And before you know it, Jordan ends up leaving, and I guess the main character files into the back of his brain. So when he's back into his home later, they're talking about maybe pranking, Jordan's sister with the main character's brother Brendan's pet spiders in his room. So he calls and says, hey, bring out these spiders and let's do something with my sister to get her back for getting me in trouble. And before we get to see this event unfold, there's a humongous, and I mean humongous, retcon, recontextualization about the entire events of the story involving the main character and Brendan, and exactly what's been going on. And I'm just going to leave it there, because if I say it, it's just going to spoil it for you. But that's what you're going to expect out of Good Friends. Now, what makes me so pissed off about this story is that the entire build-up, it's not even a scary story, and I'm not saying that you can't have imaginary friend stories in Goosebumps. I think there is room for that in kids' horror. I mean, there's an episode on the Haunting Hour TV show called My Imaginary Friend, and I think it's actually a short story in one of the collections of Nightmare Hour or Haunting Hour. I forget. I forget if it actually is, but I think it is. There's room for that. But this story, what makes it very lazy and just super annoying is the delivery of it. Because when you sit back and think about all the actions in the story, you would think that the main character wouldn't want to piss off his older brother by doing some of these things. But it comes across like, I don't know. I mean, like, if you look at it from one way, you can kind of see it as a positive. But for me, I just can't overlook how he's afraid of his older brother, and he's willing to get himself in trouble with his older brother, and he's openly admitted in the story, I should have mentioned this, that he can get beat up by him and all that, but he takes his pet spiders and puts the spiders at risk, all for nothing? Just to play pretend or something like that? No, that's as far as I'll go. That's just insane to me. I can't buy into that. It's just nonsense. So yeah, this one was really bad. I hated this one. All right, so now we're getting into the second half of this collection, and this is where it starts to get good. The sixth story is How I Won My Bet, and I thought this one was very refreshing. This felt like a concept that could be done in the Haunting Hour TV show. This story is about, I think, this kid named Michael. He is a star athlete on his baseball team. He lives in a town where the local news keeps track of Little League Baseball. Apparently it's a big thing. And he's usually very good, but he's been off on his game recently. And he did a very bad performance in a game one day. And somebody out watching the game decides to come up to him and offer him something he pretty much can't refuse. And this man is named Mr. Smith. And he looks, or at least he's described as like a bald man. He's got like a trench coat on. He's kind of mysterious. And he's like, hey kid, here's a bat. This bat is going to help you perform better in your game. All you have to do is after you play your next game, you give it back immediately and you're good to go. So the kid's like, okay. And he goes up to his next game with the new bat, and he starts hitting home run after home run after home run. And of course his team wins the game. And his team wants to go celebrate at this pizza joint. And he has to decide whether he's going to just take the bat and run to the pizza joint and not take it back to the man. And the man works, I think, at like a sports museum or something. Or he has to decide to return it and do the honorable thing. And the kid's like, well, I definitely want to keep it, but I have to find a way to tell him. So he abandons his friends. He heads to the museum. And once he meets Mr. Smith there, he notices, before he like starts talking with him, that there's these creepy lifelike wax statues everywhere. And it's kind of eerie. And he doesn't know what to think about it. But when he talks to Mr. Smith, he's like, oh, you brought back the bat. And he's like, well, that's the thing. I want to keep it. And he's like, oh, you do now? And he's like, yeah, I have to keep it. This has to be mine. And something happens, right, to where Michael, he thinks he gets to keep it, but there's a twist with Mr. Smith. And I guess the stipulation with the bat did not include what Michael wanted. So there's something to come out of it where Michael has pretty much a bad ending, and I'll just leave it there. And for this type of story, right, in a nutshell, I do think that it's effective. Even though it's a more sports-based ones, I'm not really into these type of stories. This one was still pretty serviceable. I don't know why I keep doing this, but like compared to the story before this one, Good Friends, that I gave like a 1.5 out of 5 stars. Yeah, that one was pretty terrible. This one looks so much better in comparison. It's very ingenuous. It's very experimental, and I kind of like it for that. My only negatives with it comes down to how rushed the climax is, and I do feel like the villain of the story, Mr. Smith, could have been done a bit better. I think this concept might have worked, maybe as a full book. It honestly depends on how long you can drag out the idea of the kid holding a bat, but maybe the concept can be reworked into something less simple. And I think this could be a fantastic full book. So the idea really won me over. It's just the execution in the back half that kind of hit it for me. But I'd honestly give this story maybe like a 4 out of 5 stars, truthfully. Now, the 7th story is Mr. Teddy. And Mr. Teddy, by all means, is a derivative story. It's very in the veins of the Night of the Living Dummy books. It's about this girl. She wants a new teddy bear, but her and her sister Gina get in a quarrel one day when they're out shopping with the family, and the main girl, I forget her name, I think her name's Willa or something, convinces her mom to buy her a new teddy bear, and the person who sells it to her says, hey, make sure you take care of this thing. And she's mesmerized by this new stuffed bear, but the bear has this weird presence to him. She starts to notice this when she takes it home and moves her old bear, who is called Old Bear, up to the shelf, and starts to hang out with Mr. Teddy. That's the bear's name. Some random stuff starts happening, right? And of course, if you've ever read a Night of the Living Dummy book, this might feel right at home. The first thing is she's like a collector of many things. She has like these Fabergé eggs. She finds Mr. Teddy like sitting on top of some eggs that are broken. And she's like, well, who moved Mr. Teddy there? And she automatically assumes that it's her sister Gina. And then another scene in the book involves that she comes back into her room and sees that there's stuffed animal stuffing everywhere. All of her collection stuff has been smashed. And there's like a teddy bear holding like a severed leg of a stuffed animal. And she's like, Gina must have done it. So she gets her mom involved, and Gina's like, I didn't do any of this, I swear. And she's like, well, maybe Gina didn't do it, because she starts to think that the way the bear looks at her, it could possibly be this bear. And she has this moment where she confronts it and says, hey, I think that you're the bear. But this story does something a bit different than the dummy stories does. There's a recontextualization about another stuffed animal that we may or may not have met in the story, and how they actually play into the narrative of the story. And the real realization is that everything is not as it seemed the entire story. It probably wasn't Gina. It probably wasn't Mr. Teddy. And I'll just leave it there. So yeah, this one was very effective, especially for the dummy tropes. I think this is probably the smartest of the outright dummy ripoff stories that I've seen in Goosebumps. This puts Night of the Puppet People to shame, and honestly, it puts the first and third Night of the Living Dummy book, and even Bride, to shame. Yeah, this one was really good. I've said in the past this would have been a great episode. Yeah, I definitely think that this one would have been effective, and I would have loved to see this. So yeah, Mr. Teddy. I'd probably give this one, kind of like how I won my bet, about a 4 out of 5 stars. It does kind of fall into that rehash territory, and it does kind of feel goofy at points. There's a whole scene where she thinks that this teddy bear is trying to strangle her. I mean, the teddy bear is full of stuffing. I mean, how is it going to strangle you with its soft paws? It's stuff like that no. But other than that, yeah, pretty solid one. Kind of goofy, though. All right, so let's get into the 8th story, which is Click. Now, Click, I remember really loving, but this go around, this probably had the biggest fall from grace for me for this collection. It's still good, but not as good as I remembered. It definitely has one of the more memorable, I guess, main characters, but not for the right reasons, I feel. But anyway, the main character here is Seth Gold, and he is at home one day. He tells the readers in his monologue that he really loves this channel surf. He's a big TV kid and likes to watch TV all the time. And his dad brings home this universal remote that's supposed to pretty much work on every television in the house. And Seth is like, oh, this is the coolest thing ever. And he goes to get batteries and he puts it in the remote. And the remote has like a little sound to it, like a little click that doesn't seem to be working right. So he fixes the remote and he's watching TV and his mom is nagging him. And he decides to like mute her as a joke, but it actually works. And he's like, wait a minute. This remote can like alter reality. And he unmutes his mom, and then he realizes that he can like slow-mo his dog by pressing, I guess, slow-mo on the remote. He's like, oh, this is the coolest thing ever. And he starts to carry it around with him all the time. He brings it with him to dinner, where he's able to rewind him eating a bunch of chocolate dessert. So he gets like 4 servings before anybody gets to see anything. He takes it with him to school so he can cheat on a test. He like hits the pause button, looks at the smart girl's answers, writes them down, and then gets away scot-free with it. And there's a button on the remote that's kind of scary, called the freeze frame button. And I think he used it early on for something, but there comes a point in the story where he's at lunch and he has his remote next to him, and he's been like annoyed with the lunch lady, and he puts her on mute, but when he tries to unmute her, the batteries are too low. And then he realizes the remote kind of vanishes, and this guy that he's eating lunch with took his remote and like pointed it at him. So Seth freaks out and he pushes freeze frame to freeze the guy, but then he's stuck and he can't unfreeze him. And people all around him are starting to notice that he's doing things with this remote that's altering reality, and he's getting exposed and all that. So he starts to press random buttons pointing it at everybody. But he hits a button that he probably shouldn't have hit, and that's where the story ends. It ends kind of like on a dark Twilight Zone kind of note. And this story is definitely famous for pulling from this story that Twilight Zone did. And this is also the story that's associated with that urban legend that Adam Sandler plot robbed this and turned it into his movie Click. So yeah, you know, it's a very cut and dry concept. My only negatives with this is that Seth as a character is super cardboard. In the writing of this story, I'm almost hard confident that this is ghost written, and I'm also hard confident that pretty much majority, if not almost all of the Tales to Give You Goosebumps short stories were ghost written. But the writer here just barrels through events in this book and really spends no time describing anything. It's just event after event after event. No description, no characterization. All the consequences of the remote aren't highlighted in a smart way. So it just feels really rushed through. Yeah, it's one of those things, and I hate to do this, but when I read this, I thought about how much I really loved the episode. And I'm like, a lot of the stuff I loved in the episode with the stakes and the characterization and building on that stuff just isn't here. But it's still a solid story for what it is, if that makes any sense. This is like a flat, good story. I'd probably give this maybe like a 3.75 out of 5 stars. Just flat good. I don't know what else to say. It could be a whole lot better. Now, number 9 is Broken Dolls. And Broken Dolls is a very interesting story because it's told in the third person. And honestly, I'm going to have to give this the winner for my favorite short story from this collection. So this story is about a girl and her brother. And the brother has broken one of her dolls. And this really upsets the little girl to the point where she kind of begs her mom to go out and maybe get a new doll to replace it. And the brother's kind of a jerk. He's much younger than his sister. And he's kind of like that bratty kid that gets away with everything. But they go to this, like, I guess, like, antique mall type of place. And they find this vendor. She's like this old woman. She goes by the alias doll maker or something. And she has these really realistic dolls that weigh like the exact weight of like babies. And they have these creepy looking faces and they're all different. And the doll maker tells the girl that all the dolls are different, and if you would like to take one, feel free. And she's like, nah, I'm good. She's kind of weirded out by it. But her little brother has this strange interaction with this woman where she says, oh, you know, would you like a cookie? And then she like pats his head, gives him a cookie. But when he gets home later, they realize that he's gotten very ill from eating this cookie, presumably. And the next day, he's like hallucinating, talking about dolly goop and all this stuff. And his sister's like, what is dolly goop? And he's like, oh, it's in my hair, blah, blah, blah. And he's like running a fever. And she seems to think that whatever he ate has to deal with the doll maker back at that location. So she decides to take it upon herself to do some investigation. And when she goes there to see this doll maker's shop of sorts, she notices that some of the dolls don't have faces, but weirdly enough, some of the dolls still do, and she kind of hears some voices, and she puts two and two together that the old lady is trying to turn her brother into a doll when she sees a doll that looks exactly like her brother. And she confronts the old woman, saying that, hey, I think you did this, blah, blah, blah. And the woman essentially reveals that she's like this witch of sorts. She has this jar of dolly goop, and she's going to try to put it in the hair of this girl to essentially turn her into a doll of her collection. And that's what the head pat stuff was before. But as the climax unfolds, something happens with that jar, and you find out what happens to the girl and her brother and the shop and the doll maker, I should say. And that's where I'll leave it. This story was very, very well put together, especially for a third-person story. I think this one had a lot of emotional layers. I think the stakes were actually really good. I think the doll maker villain was kind of conniving and very twisted. You don't really understand her motives of why she's doing this. That's never really touched on. And that's the sad, unfortunate part. There's also a lot of things about the abilities of this doll goop that just never get explained, and that kind of gets in the way. But I'm willing to overlook those things a tad and not consider them huge ones. Enough to give this maybe like a 4.5 out of 5 stars, which is a great for me. It's not quite perfect. It's not quite excellent, but it's just a great one that I would love to revisit over and over and over again in this book, at least. And the same thing can be applied to the last story, which is A Vampire in the Neighborhood. Now, this one I think is easily the most underrated story of this whole book here, and possibly one of the most underrated stories in the entire Tales to Give You Goosebumps lineup. So this story is about these 4 girls, and the main girl, she's kind of like the nice girl in her friend group, but there's this new girl named Helga that's recently moved to their town, and all the girls are kind of like afraid to go up and talk to her because she's kind of like a goth chick, which is kind of cool, but they think Helga has all these qualities and characteristics of a vampire. She has like very pale skin. She dresses in all black. She doesn't talk to anybody. Her eyes are kind of like silvery colored. She just looks like what you would think a vampire would look like. So they decide to kind of follow her around and kind of stalk her. It's very weird. They follow her to her house. They look inside of this home that used to belong to this really creepy person that no longer lives there or something like that. And the home is disheveled. There's like no lights on, but they see her just chilling in her living room, just staring out into nothing. And they're like, this girl is super creepy. And they're looking for her reflection. They can't really tell if she has a reflection or not. They're trying not to be seen. And, you know, at school, they continue to try to gather evidence that she might be a vampire, but they still can't really get that smoking gun that she is one. And it builds up to this climax to where they essentially get caught spying on the girl. And Helga comes outside and confronts them. And the girl's just come out and ask if Helga's a vampire. And we get the answer, and who, or I should say, whom are the vampires? Because, yeah. And you get a recontextualization twist that's actually quite smart and quite dark. And for a really unorthodox story, I found myself really loving this one. It's not quite perfect. It does have some issues here. There's plenty of scenes in the short story that I kind of mulled over that feel kind of samey. We're kind of repeating plot beats in the short story here. Just get on with it. It probably could have been a little bit shorter than it actually was. But I still enjoyed this one tremendously. I thought the ending kind of made up for some of the sins in the mid portion. So I gave this one a 4.5 out of 5 stars as well. And this is a great story. And so, yeah, in my opinion, this book right here, it's kind of run it down. The weakest ones by far. Broken Dolls, a 1.5 out of 5 stars. That one was atrocious, okay? I hated that story. I don't care what people say. You can love it if you like it. I don't. And then you have like Strained Peas and Teacher's Pet. Both are leaning that bad or just outright bad. Mishandled stories. Not a fan of either of them all that much. And then you have probably the biggest disappointment, Strangers in the Woods, which is like just okay at best. But the rest of the book, you know, 6 out of the 10, I would say are pretty average to leaning good, or up all the way up to great. Nothing perfect here. I would say, you know, to finish out the list, like it would be House of No Return is about average. You have, what is it? Click, which is just flat out good. You have How I Won My Bat, which is very good in my opinion. Mr. Teddy's very good. Then you have Broken Dolls and Vampire in the Neighborhood. Vampire in the Neighborhood is my second favorite, but Broken Dolls is my favorite. I think for quality, for Tales to Give You Goosebumps, a lot of the time I find myself half and half. This one is kind of similar, but it's more consistent than the rest of the books, I would say. There's a little more consistency here, which is saying a lot. I thought this collection was pretty well put together. If I had to rate this thing from a 0 to 5 star basis, though, given that there are some weak ones here and the fact there was no perfects, but it was mostly consistent, I found myself wanting to give this one maybe like a, you know, because just because I feel like I'm going to bump up the second book, I'm willing to give this maybe like a 3.4 to maybe 3.5 exactly. And I think I might be generous enough to give this maybe like a 3.4, which is like a D+ to me. It's fine. It's a fine book. It's a fine collection here. If it was pretty much banger after banger after banger, this would have been an A tier if it was the same quality and consistency as the 9th and 10th stories for me. But it just wasn't. Nothing really too memorable minus my 2 favorites here. And of course, Click being turned into one of my favorite episodes from the show, or at least a top 15 episode from me. But yeah, not the greatest one in the bunch. I definitely think that all said and done, 3 and 4 are probably better. But I'll save a lot what I want to say about the books as a whole when I do a ranking of just the books themselves and the collections. But yeah, this one, I gave it about a 3.4 out of 5, which I think I'm being perfectly fair with, given all that I'm given with this series in general. I've had worse times, but I've also had better. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the first Tales to Give You Goosebumps collection here. What's your thoughts on this collection? Do you love all these stories? What's your favorite one? What's your least favorite one? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.